It was still dark outside when the ground in western Colombia began to move. Families were asleep. Children were curled up in their beds. And in less than 2 minutes, entire neighborhoods that had stood for generations were gone. This wasn't a small tremor that rattled a few windows. This was the strongest earthquake to hit this part of Colombia in more than a century. And it struck in one of the most beloved places on Earth, the lush green mountains where the world's coffee is grown. What happened in those 2 minutes would change thousands of lives forever. But almost nobody outside Colombia understood how bad it truly was, till the death toll kept climbing and kept climbing and kept climbing. This story matters because it is still unfolding right now. Rescue crews are still searching. Families are still waiting outside piles of broken concrete, hoping to hear a voice. Entire cities have been placed under the highest possible disaster alert. And the region at the center of it all isn't just any region. It is Colombia's coffee heartland, a place so important to the country's identity and economy that its damage will be felt for years, not just days. In the next few minutes, you will understand exactly what happened. Why this earthquake became so deadly, and why it has reopened wounds from a tragedy Colombia has never fully forgotten. Let's go back to the beginning, to the quiet mountains, where this story starts. Western Colombia is home to a region locals call the Eje Cafetero, the coffee axis. It stretches across the departments of Caldas, Risaralda, and Quindío, with nearby areas in Valle del Cauca, Antioquia, and Chaco, also part of the wider coffee-growing landscape. The hills here are steep, green, and covered in coffee plants that thrive in the cool mountain air and rich volcanic soil. This isn't just farmland. It is one of Colombia's most treasured cultural landscapes, a place tied to the country's history, economy, and identity. But underneath all that natural beauty lies something far more dangerous. Colombia sits in one of the most seismically active corners of the planet, a place where the Nazca, Cocos, and South American tectonic plates grind against each other deep below the surface. For decades, scientists have known this region carries serious. At 7:34 in the morning local time, a massive earthquake struck near the small rural town of San Jose del Palmar in the department of Chaco. The United States Geological Survey measured it at magnitude 7.4. Some seismic agencies measured it even slightly higher. This wasn't a shallow surface-level quake either. Struck at a depth of more than 100 kilometers underground, a deep rupture that allowed the shaking to spread across an enormous area. But that wasn't the biggest surprise. The shaking lasted for nearly 2 full minutes. No minutes may not sound like much, but for anyone who has ever felt an earthquake, 2 minutes of violent shaking feels like an eternity. The tremor was so powerful that it was felt in 32 of Colombia's regional capitals, cross borders entirely, reaching neighboring Ecuador, Panama, and Venezuela. In the capital city of Bogotá, more than 200 miles away, sirens rang out and buildings swayed as residents ran into the streets. Video captured at Pereira's airport showed the terminal violently shaking, large sections of the ceiling collapsing as passengers dove under furniture for cover. In Cali, Colombia's third-largest city, with more than 2 million residents, entire blocks of buildings folded in on themselves within seconds. Local officials reported at least 20 large buildings had completely collapsed in that city alone. What happened next changed everything about how the world understood this disaster. As the sun rose that Monday, the true scale of destruction began to appear. In Pereira, the capital of Risaralda and one of the hardest-hit cities, entire residential blocks were reduced to piles of broken concrete and twisted steel. In Manizales, one of the towers on a historic cathedral cracked and partially collapsed, a building that had stood as a landmark for generations. 7 airports across the region were forced to suspend operations entirely. Hospitals, roads, water systems, and power networks were all disrupted across the hardest-hit provinces. And then came the number that stopped people in their tracks. But rescue workers on the ground already suspected this was only the beginning. The truth was even more shocking than anyone expected. The search crews began digging. Through collapsed hospitals, schools, and apartment buildings, the death toll did not slow down. It climbed to over 160, then past 200. Within days, local authorities reported the toll had crossed 280 people, with nearly 4,000 people injured and hundreds still listed as missing. Entire families were unaccounted for. Officials warned painfully that the number was likely to keep rising as rescue teams reached areas that had been cut off by damaged roads and collapsed bridges. Among the most heartbreaking details, too. Emerge, part of a hospital's pediatric and newborn care unit, had collapsed during the quake. In Valle del Cauca, a regional governor confirmed that children were among the dead. In the rural province of Choco, some of the poorest and most remote communities in Colombia bore some of the earliest reported losses. In villages where emergency crews take hours, sometimes longer, just to reach, then investigators uncovered something nobody expected. Nearly 100 aftershocks followed the main earthquake within the first day alone. Each aftershock sent already weakened buildings closer to collapse. Rescue workers were forced to pause their searches again and again as the ground shook beneath their feet, terrified that unstable structures could come down on top of the very people trying to save lives. One rescue worker, searching for survivors and a missing rescue dog beneath the rubble, described the agonizing uncertainty of the search. Moments earlier, there had been faint scratching sounds from beneath the debris, then silence. Still, the team refused to give up hope, calling for more volunteers with shovels and sticks to keep digging by hand. This is the turning point in the story, the moment when Colombia realized just how deeply this disaster echoed the past. For the people living in Armenia, one of the towns hit hardest by both this earthquake and the catastrophic one in 1999, the destruction brought back memories many had spent decades trying to move past. The 1999 Armenia earthquake had killed close to 1,200 people, injured thousands more, and destroyed tens of thousands of homes. It remains one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern Colombian history. Watching similar scenes unfold again, collapsed buildings, displaced families, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, was almost unbearable for residents who had lived through it once already. One resident, whose family had survived the 1999 disaster, described the fear returning instantly the moment the shaking began this time. But this earthquake wasn't just about human tragedy. It struck the very heart of Colombia's identity, its coffee industry. Colombia is one of the largest coffee producers in the entire world, famous for its smooth, rich Arabica beans grown in high-altitude volcanic soil. The Eje Cafetero isn't just scenic countryside. It is the literal foundation of an industry that touches millions of livelihoods, from small family farms to major international coffee brands sold across the globe. As soon as the shaking stopped, Colombia's National Federation of Coffee Growers mobilized teams to assess the damage to farms and rural infrastructure across the region. At the time the assessments began, no full damage report for the coffee sector had been completed. But the Federation's leadership made their priorities clear immediately. Saving lives came first, counting the cost to coffee. Farms would come after. Still, anyone familiar with the 1999 disaster knew what might be coming. That earlier earthquake had damaged or destroyed thousands of coffee farms and left lasting scars on the regional economy for years. Then came another twist that widened the scope of this disaster even further. Just days after the earthquake, early economic assessments began estimating that total damage and recovery costs could reach as high as $2 billion. That number covers collapsed homes, damaged hospitals, wrecked roads and bridges, disrupted power and water systems, and yes, damage to coffee farms and the rural economy that depends on them. For a country already balancing other financial pressures, a disaster of this size adds enormous strain. Not just to individual families rebuilding their homes, but to the national government trying to fund the recovery. And this disaster arrived at an extraordinary moment politically. Colombia had just inaugurated a new president, emergency response efforts within his very first days in office. He confirmed that an estimated 5,000 homes had been damaged or destroyed, and that roughly 700 people had been injured, numbers that would continue climbing in the days that followed. The consequences of this disaster reached far beyond Colombia's borders almost immediately. International support began arriving within hours. The United States committed $15.5 million toward emergency shelter, food and disaster assessments, while also working to assist American tourists caught in the affected region. The Inter-American Development Bank pledged $50 million in immediate support for recovery efforts. The Vatican sent humanitarian funds through the Colombian Episcopal Conference, Rescue teams from Mexico, some of whom had just finished responding to catastrophic earthquakes in neighboring Venezuela only weeks earlier, redirected their efforts toward Colombia to help dig through the rubble in Cali. Not every offer of help arrived smoothly. Some international rescue teams faced delays or were denied permission to enter the disaster zones immediately, a decision that frustrated many Colombian citizens watching. In cities like Cali, long lines of volunteers formed beside collapsed buildings, passing buckets of rubble hand to hand in an effort to reach anyone still trapped beneath the debris. Soldiers, police officers, and civilians worked side by side through the night, using excavators when they were available and their bare hands when they weren't. A social media influencer who happened to be filming at Barreras Airport the moment the quake struck later described walking across the devastated city on foot for 2 hours, past scenes of destruction, because phone signals had gone down and roads had become impassable. This is where the story reaches its most important truth. Every single number in this disaster, every death, every injury, every missing person, represents a real family whose life changed in less than 2 minutes. Behind the statistics are children pulled from hospital nurseries, coffee farmers uncertain whether their land will ever recover, and entire towns where the rhythm of daily life has been completely shattered. As search and rescue efforts continued into their following days, officials repeatedly cautioned that the confirmed death toll, though already devastating, was very likely to rise further as crews reached the most remote and hardest-hit villages. So what does this earthquake mean for Colombia going forward? In the immediate term, the country faces the enormous task of search and rescue, followed by an even larger task, rebuilding. Homes need to be repaired or replaced. Hospitals need to be restored to full function. Roads and bridges connecting isolated mountain communities need urgent repair, especially in provinces like Chaco, where damaged infrastructure has made reaching survivors painfully slow. And an entire coffee-growing economy, one that families have depended on for generations, must be assessed and, where possible, rebuilt from the ground up. There is also a deeper, more emotional rebuilding that has to happen. For a region that already carried the memory of the 1999 tragedy, this earthquake has reopened. Wounds that many believed had finally begun to heal. Rebuilding physical structures is one challenge. Rebuilding a community's sense of safety, after watching history repeat itself in the very same mountains, is another challenge entirely. And yet, in the middle of unimaginable loss, there are also stories of extraordinary resilience. Neighbors helping neighbors dig through rubble by hand. International strangers flying across oceans to help a country they had never visited. A newly elected president stepping directly into crisis leadership within his first days in office. A coffee federation mobilizing to protect not just buildings, but the livelihoods tied to every hillside farm across the region. So here's the question this story leaves behind. Can a region that has already survived one of the deadliest earthquakes in its history find the strength to rebuild after being struck again, in almost the very same place, a quarter of a century later? The people of Colombia's coffee region have proven once before that they can rebuild from devastation. Whether history repeats that resilience, or whether this disaster leaves a deeper and more lasting scar, is a story still being written, one search, one rescue, and one rebuilt home at a time. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what part of this disaster affected you the most. If you want to see more real stories that matter, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss an update as recovery efforts in Colombia continue in the days and weeks ahead.